Hello there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. If you're just tuning in now, welcome to Flutter Day. And if you're coming back, welcome back. We've seen and heard so many great questions from everyone, some amazing code pens shared, and of course, lots of learning happening. We're getting close to the end of our day, but not to the end of our content. Up next is Kevin chatting with Bob from the Dart team about null safety, and then we'll have one more live Q&A session focused on Dart and null safety right after their chat. Let's listen in.
Hi, my name is Kevin Moore. I'm a product manager on the Dart team. And today with me here is Bob.
Hi, I'm Bob Nystrom. I'm a software engineer on the Dart team, working mostly on the language.
And we have cool language things to talk about today, right, Bob?
So much cool language things to talk about.
Null safety.
Yeah, I feel like this is all we talk about. It's been a long time coming, but we're very close to having the whole thing fully shipped and out the door, and I am very eager to have it done.
As am I. And this is one of those things that, you want to do correctly. So we've taken our time and we're making sure we're doing a good job on it. So maybe before we get into specifics of how Dart does null safety, can I kind of give the intro to null safety in general and the idea of null safety in languages?
Yeah, so the high level goal is with null safety, and this is something that a number of languages are doing now, is to avoid null reference exceptions at runtime and instead push those forward into compile time static checking. So that's what we're doing. Part of the reason it's taken us so long to do this on Dart is that we are taking that approach and we're pushing it farther than a lot of other languages in that the system we've built is fully sound. So the guarantee that we give you is if you've fully migrated your code to null safety, not only do you will you not statically get any null reference errors at runtime, but because this is a fully sound system, the compiler can take advantage of that fact. So we can use it for optimization purposes. So we will generate smaller code because we don't need to insert null checks, and we'll generate faster code sometimes because we don't have to box values. So we're trying to, we decided that if we're going to do this, we're going to try and get as much mileage out of it as we can, even though it makes it a much more difficult, larger design problem.
You kind of get it, I think of it at 3 levels, right? So level 1 is I get the red squiggles I expect in my IDE. So it tells me if I'm doing something wrong, which is great, right? Just that is great from a kind of a productivity perspective. I can look at an API documentation and know if null is accepted. I don't have to guess. But then we have level 2, which is at runtime, assuming all the code has been migrated. The runtimes will make sure that if null does flow through, that we get errors up front, like it'll kind of babysit us at compile time. And then the third level is we actually get size and speed improvements potentially. That sounds great.
Yeah, so the model that we have here is not that there's not a moralistic tone where null is bad and you should feel bad for using it and we're going to stamp it out. It's more that, we do feel that null is actually a pretty useful value, right? Like it's nice to be able to represent the absence of a thing. That comes into play in a lot of APIs. So we're not trying to eliminate null. What we're trying to do is give you tools so that you can control and understand where null is going to flow through your program, and in places where you've allowed null to flow into it, to make sure that you're using it in a safe way.
That sounds great. Let's look at some code.
I love code. Code is my favorite part.
Okay, so here's an example here, and I'm glad you picked a coffee because, these days it seems like I drink a lot more of it, so coffee's a great example. And it looks like if you look at the header here, it says, Dartpad with null safety. So I guess if you're watching this video in a world before we've actually released this to the wild, you'll know that there's a special version of Dartpad now. We'll give you details in a bit that has null safety enabled. And what's crazy is, this doesn't look like special Dart code or null, anything new beyond, the existing Dart. So this is null safe code.
Right. Yeah. So this is exactly what you would write before null safety. And it is also what you would write after null safety. Our experience is that, we've migrated a lot of code at this point. Is about 90% of your code just doesn't need any changes. So, this is the code you would already have, but now you're getting fully safe static null checking. And by that, what we mean is, you can see that in serve coffee, you have a parameter of type string. Without null safety in previous versions of Dart, you would be allowed to pass null to that, and that's not a compile error, but it would fail at runtime when it tried to call the plus method on it. Once you've opted into null safety, that string type annotation does not include null anymore. That means literally only strings. But because you are passing a string to it here, this code is still correct and it still does what you want it to do, except now you have the static guarantee that that plus method that you're calling on temp is never going to throw an exception.
Cool. So let's throw a wrench in here maybe. Maybe I'll just make this a, let's copy this and let's do maybe an optional value, because by default, in Seattle at least, the default is usually warm coffee. So I've made my parameter here optional and I'm getting a warning. So what's going on there? Or an error?
Right. Yeah, so this is a good example of where we say, it's not that we think of null as being bad. Optional parameters are a good case where you can see that having the absence of a value is a useful thing for an API to express. But now you're saying something confusing to the compiler, right? So you're saying, I want this parameter to be optional, which means that when you don't pass it, then the value null is going to come in. But you've given it the type string, which doesn't permit null. So the compiler's like, I don't understand what you're trying to say here. So you need to kind of clarify things for me and tell me what you actually want.
So I mean, the simple thing I'm thinking here is, right, is like, I want hot coffee, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that seems to fix things. And honestly, what makes me happy here is, I would use named arguments or positional arguments. And then there's paranoid part in the back of my brain, which is like, I probably should still check for null, even if I pass the value in, but I don't have to do that anymore, right?
Right. Yeah. Now null will never come in there.
Cool. But let's say we're not going to be quite so sophisticated and actually, so I need to actually change the type here and say, oh no, like the string might be null, right? It might not be provided.
Yeah. So another option, if you don't want to stick in a default value, is you can say like, yeah, I actually do want to allow null to flow in here. I want to say that null is a valid value for this temp parameter. And then in the body of my code, I'll handle that.
Cool. So it looks like that works, but obviously now we have the problem, which is this value might be null and we're getting an error, which is what you'd expect. So you'd see this in your IDE as well,
right.
That I can't add null and a string together, which makes lots of sense.
Right. So it's, by making something nullable, you were claiming that you will handle it, but clearly here we've not handled it and the compiler's telling you didn't.
So the naive thing I think I could do, which is, if this equals null, I guess return hot coffee.
Yep. So dynamically, this is exactly the kind of code you would write before and you would write without any static checking for null safety. And with the null safety feature, that same code is exactly what you write now, and it does what you want. So there's actually some cool stuff going on under the hood here, right? So we do control flow analysis over local variables and parameters. So what we can see here is the compiler is smart enough to know that if temp is null, then that if statement, the body of that's going to execute, and it will always return, which means you'll never get to the last statement in that serve coffee function unless temp is not null. So then it automatically promotes that parameter to having a non-nullable type, and then it lets you call methods on it again because it knows it's statically safe to do that.
So if I comment out this return statement, boom,
right.
The error comes back because this might be a null thing and I can't add null in a string.
Yeah, now it's saying there is a path, at least one path where that code can be reached and temp is null.
So maybe I'm doing argument checking here and I could do, throw argument error.
Yeah, anything that causes it to be not reachable.
But obviously I can't do, return null here because this is not type
return
null.
Type.
Now, could I even be, and even to be, I like having code with fewer return statements. I know it's kind of an option, but could I go in here and just do this?
Try it.
Oh, that's super cool. And so that means it's the same thing. So either an early return means I'm not going to get here with a null temp, or if I make sure I assign the variable there, I can do that.
Yeah, so we actually do pretty sophisticated control flow analysis and assignment analysis to make sure that whenever it's statically, whenever a human would look at this code and be like, I'm pretty sure I can tell that it's not going to be null, hopefully the control flow analysis will be able to come to the same conclusion.
Cool. And then I'm also remembering there's something else subtly we could do here, right? Which is.
Yeah, so the code, so this is an interesting example. So the code we wrote before is if you want to handle null because you know that null is valid and that's a thing that you want to accept. There are cases you run into where you know that something will not be null, but it's in a way that you can't prove it to the static type system, right? Like there are some times where you have dynamic or domain knowledge about a program that the static type system can't see, and you just need to forcibly assert it. You just say, look, I promise you this won't be null. And the bang operator, that little postfix exclamation mark is one way to do that. So what that means is it basically says, check that the value is not null. If it is null, throw an exception, right? Because because we give you a sound system, we can't just poke a hole in it and let the code continue to execute. So there will be a runtime failure if that is null, but if it's not null, it basically casts it to its non-nullable type and then lets you do stuff with it. So that's your sort of explicit opting out of the static checking for null safety and opting into runtime checking because you know better the dynamic semantics of your program.
Cool. So in this case, the question mark is kind of helps me define the type. Say this is a null string. And the exclamation point is effectively like, I'm asserting here, this is not null, don't give me an error. And so if I actually went in here, let's do if temp equals null. And now I'm not getting an error, I'm getting a warning, which is saying this is not needed because we've proven it's not null here. And so the assertion's not needed, right?
Yeah, we've added some kind of productivity warnings where, we give you errors if you are trying to do something that could be null, but we also tell you if you have pointless code now, if we've analyzed it and we can tell it can't be null, then there's operations that don't make sense for you to do. And it'll just tell you like, hey, you can delete this. Your code's safe. You don't need to use bang operator. Or if you were to do another if temp equals null check there, it will tell you that equals null check is also essentially dead code, right?
Sounds good.
Okay, so the previous example was all within the body of a function and was working with local variables and parameters. And control flow analysis works really great for that. But when it comes to fields, instance fields, static fields, top-level variables, even trying to do sophisticated whole program analysis, traditionally doing control flow analysis for that doesn't work very well. It's really hard to tell which methods get called on instances in which order. So here's a really simple example. So you have this class, it has a field, it has two methods that initialize this field and then another method that uses it. And the intent of the API is that you will always call either heat or chill before you call serve. And if you do that, everything works fine. But the compiler can't prove that you'll do that. So it's giving you this error. That's what that error is saying. So it's saying you have this field, it hasn't been initialized yet, and it wants to know what to do, what you want to do with that. So Kevin, what do you want to do with that?
So I can think of three things. We'll start with, I think, the most obvious, right? Which is I can just, set this up in the constructor.
Yeah, so that's totally the easiest, safest fix. And when you can do that, this is the best way to do it, right? So Dart has these constructor initialization lists. And if you initialize every field there, then that statically guarantees that you can never see that field in an uninitialized state, and the compiler's happy with you. But sometimes you don't, when you're creating an instance of a class, you don't have enough data at that point in time to fully initialize it, right? Like assume that we designed this weird API for a reason and we don't know what temp should be until after the coffee class has been instantiated. Then what should we do?
Well, I could go back to semantics that we kind of have from before null safety in Dart, which is I can say, oh, like this, could be null, and then I'll assert before I use it that it's not null.
Right, yeah, so this is one solution, right? You can just acknowledge that like, yes, this field is uninitialized for part of its time, and we'll use null to represent that. So we'll give it a nullable type. And then at the point that we use it, we require that it's not null. So we're going to assert that by using the bang operator. We know that that will fail at runtime if a user calls serve without calling heat and chill, but we're okay with that. And sometimes this is a good solution too, right? If you have, if there was code in the body of this class that was dynamically checking the temp field to see if it had been initialized and wanted to be able to see that it was null, this is a great solution, right? Because then it gives you a nice way to model that. But in this case, the intent of this class is you should never read temp and get null out of it, right? That is not a valid value for this. So giving that field a nullable type kind of sends a confusing signal to anyone else maintaining the class because it looks like null is meaningful, but really you just don't want it to be, and you're just trying to shut up the compiler.
So I think what we need to do is we have a new keyword, right?
We do. So there's another feature we've added for this.
Late.
So late is this new modifier that we've added. It's kind of like latenit in Kotlin. It's kind of like lazy in Swift. Kind of covers both of their use cases. So as you can see, the compiler shuts up. It says it's happy with this code now, which is kind of interesting because the field isn't being initialized and it can't statically prove that it's safe. So what late means is one way to think of late is it says, instead of checking this property statically, check it at runtime. So you're saying, I want this field to have type string, which means it's not nullable. But by making it late, you're saying, but enforce that guarantee at runtime. So what that does is it allows you to initialize it later. That's kind of why we picked the word late. But if you read it and it has not been initialized yet, that will throw a runtime exception, right? So it's almost as if every use of temp in the body of the class gets into a sort of automatic bang operator appended to it, right?
So this, I could still get a runtime exception here.
So that can fail, right? So the reason we make you write the word late is we want you to know that you have to opt into this because it is something that could cause a runtime failure.
But I can't, go in here and do temp equals null.
Right. So that's the cool thing about using late instead of using string question is the compiler knows that you don't want null to be a valid value for this field, right? So it won't let you initialize it with null because you said, no, it's just a string.
That's super cool. So maybe we can go through do you want to summarize the language bits we discussed today?
Yeah. So the way I look at this, the way we on the language team look at this is adding null safety to the language. At first you think of it as just, well, we're just adding static checks to the compiler and it's stricter and it yells at you more. And that gets you part of the way there. That gets you a language that gives you null safety, but it doesn't necessarily give you a language you can use, right? So we start with that. And then what we did is we layered on a couple of extra usability features, right? So we have the bang operator, there's the late modifier, there's the control flow analysis we do and the type promotion based on that, which is a really big part of the usability story. There are a couple of other features too that we didn't get into, like required named parameters, probably some other stuff that I'm forgetting.
Final late is pretty cool.
What's that?
Final late or late final?
Yeah, so you can apply the late modifier to final fields, and then you get some interesting checking there. We do definite assignment analysis. So the intent here then, if we do our job right, is we give you the safety and the performance of a sound non-nullable type system, but then we also still give you most of the usability that you had before, where you can kind of just write code that works the way you expect it to work in an imperative language, and you just get better static guarantees and performance while you do that. So
that sounds great.
Yeah, so that's nice. The tricky part though is that Dart is already in the wild and there's millions and millions of lines of code out there. So that's the other real big challenge for us.
Right. So it's important for people to know that we're working on a model here where obviously we have lots of Dart code in the wild. So how do you get your code to null safety? So depending on when you're watching this, we might be in a different spot. And so we have a website you can go to see what the current story is. The first thing we want to let people know is you can run what we call mixed mode code, which is you can have code that has been migrated to full null safety. And then in your own package or packages you depend on, or packages, code that depends on your package, they don't have to be migrated yet to null safety. So we do allow mixed mode. There are some trade-offs there. Obviously, you don't get full soundness in that case. So you don't get all the runtime guarantees that you want. And obviously any kind of speed improvement or size improvement, and we have some really good size and speed improvements already, those won't come until everything is fully migrated to null safety. But you can mix and match. And we have tooling that should make it easier, both in terms of helping you migrate your code and also just understanding, if your dependencies have been migrated, you can look on the package site to see if a package has been migrated. So we try to make that easy. And we'll have more information on tools and packages, things on the package site later, as well as obviously we've have a version of Dartpad you can use now that has null safety enabled and you could play with. So all the details will be available whenever you're watching this at dart.dev/null-safety. That page will have information about the current state of things and how you can enable Dart safety in your code. So for Bob, I'm Kevin. Thanks for watching.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our last and final Ask Flutter segment. We're going to be talking all about Dart, the language, and null safety. A lot of cool features to talk about, a lot of cool things going on here. With me here again is John Ryan, and we also have another guest, Michael Thompson. Thank you both for joining us.
Hi.
Hello, good
thanks so
morning or
much.
good afternoon, wherever, depending on where you are. Michael, in particular, you're new to the Flutter Day stream, so I'm curious for your thoughts first. What is it about null safety that you find particularly interesting or compelling?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I am a product manager on the Dart team. Null safety is a feature that really, really excites me. It's something I've worked with the awesome Dart language team on for several years now. And there's many layers to that feature, and excited about all of them. It begins with another great tool for declaring your intent in APIs. You can very clearly differentiate between things you want to be null and you don't want to be null. And when you consume an API, whether you look at the code or you're in Dart doc, it becomes really easy to see what the intent is. Second, I think it's a great feature for developer productivity. As you're writing your code, you will see analysis time errors that before were runtime crashes. So it really helps you catch those things really, really early. And then third, it's not just good for developers. It's really good for the app consumers as well. Dart has sound null safety, so we not only make the apps more safe and less prone to crashing, we will also get better performance with sound null safety.
Awesome. Yeah, John, did you have any additional thoughts on what about it is that what about null safety is compelling to you?
Well, I think one unique thing too is that the Dart language allows or provides the tools to migrate your code. So there's a migration tool that will be coming out, and so having the ability to, as a developer, easily upgrade is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when I look at some of these questions that came in from Ask Flutter before the streams, so over the last couple of weeks, we have a question from Sagar from India, who is asking, what is the next big feature after null safety that the Dart team is working on? Michael, as a product manager for Dart, I was wondering if you could give us some insight there.
Yeah, I can try. So at any point in time, we actually work on a range of features because we go through a very long, elaborate process when we add new language features. We start with looking at a great pool of ideas, some coming from the community, some coming from the team itself, some coming from our customers. We do brainstorming. We write initial proposals. We write very detailed proposals, we write specifications, we do prototypes, and then eventually at some point we do implementation. And along that whole path, some ideas we had initially that we thought were great turn out to be not so great. So it's sort of a funnel process. And one of my favorite things about working on the Dart project is that we are an open source project. So we're very open with information. So if you go to the Dart Lang organization on GitHub and you look in the language repo, under projects, you will find what we call the language funnel. And that's where we track all the features, all the way from initial ideas, all the way to implementation. So that's a great way of getting some insight into what we're working on. And you will see a few things there, like we're looking at type aliases, we're considering the whole space around multiple return values, and a few other things.
John, anything that piqued your interest in terms of like going through some of those new features coming up, and any one particular that you're interested in seeing?
Well, I think the multiple return value sounds interesting. I'm planning to read more about that. That's one of the things that I like too, is that you can go to the language issue tracker and participate, read through the discussions. Everything is very open.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a great way, just as someone not on the Dart team, to keep up with where things are and where things are going, and any of the new things that are coming on. So definitely appreciate that openness for sure. So I'm going to go to some of our live stream questions. We've got a number from Ask Flutter from Twitter, but we've got some here from the live stream, and so this. Looking at Dart features in particular, Alexander is asking about why, when we extend abstract classes that have constructor parameter child class, wait, let me reread this. Alexander says, why when we extend abstract class that has constructor parameter child class does not extend it? Trying to figure out what Alexander's trying to say here. So what I'm reading that as is, let's say I have an abstract class and it has a parameter in the constructor, and I have a new class that extends that abstract class. It sounds like Alexander is saying that extension doesn't inherit that constructor parameter. That's my interpretation of that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I'd have to look at the code actually to fully answer this, but I don't believe abstract classes can have constructors. I could be wrong on that. So I'm a little bit confused by that question.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm sorry,
that probably, yeah. That probably makes sense for why the child doesn't inherit the constructor then. If abstract classes can't have the constructor, then that would be why the implementation doesn't accept it or inherit it. So when we get into the Dart compiler itself, we had a number of questions on Ask Flutter ahead of time about the compiler and performance and app size and a number of other things. And the question in particular is, does the AOT compiler perform a tree shake to remove other platforms' code? And if not, is it going to be in the future? Michael, you're nodding yes. John, you're nodding yes. Michael, starting with you, like tree shaking, talk us through that.
Yeah, do you want to take this one, John?
Yeah, it's something that was added originally for the web. So Dart is a web language. It compiles to the web, and reducing the JavaScript code size is super important. But if you do it at the kernel level, at the language level, you get those same benefits when you compile for AOT. So any iOS or Android app that uses Flutter removes any unused code. And if you're a Flutter developer, we do have some documentation on measuring your app size. There is a doc on that on the flutter.dev website.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add to that is also when you use platform-specific plugins, the Flutter build system makes sure only to pull in what's needed for the platform you're building for. So generally, I believe we have pretty good support for making sure that you can target all the various platforms.
Awesome. And so I have another one from, I think this one is a little bit easier than the last one, from the live stream. Arakash asks, will the new keyword be removed anytime in the future? Or will I have to refactor my existing apps to not use new anymore in case future versions of Dart drop new support? So new support. Where is it going? I know it's kind of come and gone, and whether it's optional or required, and what's the best practice. Are we just going to remove it at some point, or is it going to stay around? Michael?
That's a good question. Let me talk about the background a little bit. So that was actually a language feature we built in collaboration with the Flutter team, I think about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years ago. Because when we started looking at UI code for Flutter apps, which is sort of a very special thing, right? There's no second language for describing the UI. It's all just Dart code. There were a lot of news as you're trying to read down your widget tree, and they seemed a little redundant, and they sort of got in the way of seeing all the types you're instantiating. But of course, it'd be a very breaking change to suddenly change the constructor syntax for Dart. So we designed this feature for optional news in constructor calls. And I think we were a little uncertain about how it'd be received, but I think it's been a runaway success. And I use it all the time myself. And whenever I see code snippets from customers, it's also the predominant style. I believe also a number of people actually by now have configured lints to make sure that their code bases don't use new. So sort of a reminder you can configure as you're coding. Would we ever outright de-support it? I mean, I've learned in this industry never to say never. We don't have any such current plans, but who knows?
John, does your code have news in it or not?
No, I think I add that lint actually.
Makes sense. Yeah, I've just always not used new. I personally learned Dart in the context of Flutter, and I just stopped. I just never used new, and then so that I just never got into the habit. But that lint sounds super useful too, and I know a lot of people coming from other languages get used to saying this thing is a class-like thing, therefore I need to use a new. And so it's then nice to have a reminder that it's not necessary, and can kind of feel the redundancy when you get into that tree with all the news. Yeah, so going over to Ask Flutter from Twitter, we have a low-level question here from about Dart, and where Firat is asking why Dart doesn't have a real multi-threading implementation. They watched official videos that they're trying to answer this question, but they couldn't find a decent. It sounds like they couldn't get a real sense for the reason there. Why can't Dart code run on multiple cores, and what is the motivation behind not having a real multitasking implementation?
The multi-threading is probably one of the most complicated topics in computer science. I recall back to being a student. It was just simply one of the things you fought with the most. Very abstractly, it gets really tricky when you have multiple threads in shared state, because then you need synchronization. And when we designed Dart a long time ago, that was not the complexity we thought we wanted to bring to the table. What we do have in Dart, though, is still support. You can utilize multiple cores. We have a much simpler model based on something we call isolates. And isolates do not share state, and thus you do not get into the synchronization problems. It's still a space, though, that we look at from time to time, and there's actually some really exciting prototyping happening right now, where we're looking at, can we kind of get the best of both worlds? Because something we're seeing in Flutter apps is this desire to do work in the background while the UI is still running really smoothly. And then when some background process is done doing something, can you kind of hand the result back to the UI? And this can be a bit tricky with the current isolate model. So I'm really hopeful we can do something in that area where we kind of combine the two things and get the best of both worlds. What do you think, John? Do you use isolates?
Yeah, we have a Flutter sample for isolates. One common use case is deserializing a large JSON blob, and you really don't want to be doing something that large on the UI thread. So using an isolate is a great use case there. Yeah, exciting to see the new experiments we're running and what we could do in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely reminisce back to studying multi-threading in operating systems and being, yeah, that's complicated stuff for sure. So I've got a pair of questions here that feel related to me, so I want to ask them simultaneously. So we have one from Ask Flutter beforehand on Twitter, from Jaff, and we have a question in the live stream from Herman, and both of these questions relate to kind of the separation and the intertwining of Dart and Flutter. So Jeff from Ask Flutter asks, will we ever be able to incorporate backend development using Dart? And Herman on the live stream asks, is Dart and Flutter meant to be a markup language with little logic and to write just the view layer and then interface with some backend like Kotlin, C++, Rust, or something else, and what interface is recommended there? So those to me kind of are both saying, is Dart Flutter only, or are there other things you can do with it as well?
I love that
John,
question. Maybe I can.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Michael. Yeah.
Sorry for jumping in here. I'm passionate about this one.
Yes.
Let me talk a little bit about the last part, and then maybe John can talk about the first part. So Dart is a fully fledged programming language, right? And we very much have a layered model where the Dart SDK sits below the Flutter SDK. And there are lots of awesome experiences that we power in the Flutter SDK through the Dart SDK. But I think if you sort of poke around a bit and look at what we do ourselves, and also when I talk to customers, there are many other things you can do with Dart. And one of them actually happens to be backends. So John, can you maybe talk a little bit about what you see with backends?
Yeah, so I work a little bit on Dartpad, and the Dart Services project is fully open source, and it's purely running in Dart. And the other project that we run on the back end is Pub itself. So you can check out the source code for those and see how that's working. One of the main packages is Shelf that I'm familiar with. There's also some really great community packages like Aqueduct and I think there's one more.
Angel is another one I've seen.
Angel, yes. I haven't used Angel myself, but
yeah, I tried it out once not too long ago. It was pretty nice. It was pretty decent. And so I'm hearing basically yes. Like if you want to use Dart for something other than Flutter, yeah, absolutely, go and do it. It supports it just as well as we'd want it to. And I think there was a second question kind of wrapped up in the last one from Herman, who was asking about what if I did want to have an interface to something else? So I could see maybe I want to use Dart as the controller for an embedded thing on Arduino or a Raspberry Pi, and I need to call out to some C code potentially to interface with something else. How do I do that in Dart? What's the interface there?
Oh, there are a number of things you can do there. When it comes to traditional backends, I talked to a bunch of customers that just basically do it with networking, whether it's straight HTTP or you use something like gRPC that's more structured. And there's a lot of flexibility there. So I even hear some customers that maybe start with a backend in not Dart and move it to Dart, or the other way around. They prototype in Dart and then they build a production stack in Go or something. And if you use something like gRPC, you can swap those things out pretty easily. What else did I forget, John? I guess there are other ways we can interop as well, right?
we also have FFI, right?
Yes.
So
So for those who don't know FFI, can you define that for us?
It's a foreign function interface API for Dart. So if you have C code, you can grab references to pointers to C objects in memory, structs in memory. And we do have some samples for that in the Dartlang samples repo. And we're maintaining that and making sure that anyone who's trying to use that is having a good experience.
Yeah, FFI can be really great, whether you're calling the operating system and some of those APIs that often are native APIs, or maybe you have some existing native codes that you just want to hold on to a little bit longer. And FFI is a great way of leveraging that.
So there's a number of questions about specific Dart features. And do we support certain things, or will we support certain things? I want to get a couple of them and then maybe get your thoughts on, and I know, Michael, you kind of addressed this at the top of our time, but the thoughts on the development of new features and how people can keep tabs on a feature that they want, or maybe suggest a new one, or maybe see if they can affect that decision in some way. So there's a couple that we can look at. The first one from, and I'm going to butcher this, I'm sure, but Erluxman is asking, when will we get a data class-like feature? For example, rich enum types or sealed classes in Dart. Those would be great. I mean, I've tried to build an enum based on my fingers typed from other languages. I just want to do enum curly bracket and then do something, and it doesn't exist. So are we going to get some kind of sealed data class like that at some point in the future?
That's a really, really exciting space. And there's a range of features there. You could do data classes alone, you could do sealing alone, you could do the two things together, you could combine it with enums. There's just a lot of combinatorics there that makes it really interesting. And actually, that's also one of the things that makes it really hard, because we've looked at this a number of times. And when we talk to various customers, you get different feelings for what it is they're looking for. That being said, I mean, I personally, at least, I'm I'm very interested in looking at, is there something we can do to really make it less laborious to create classes that predominantly carry state? So I can't really promise any specific feature right now, but it's definitely an area I hope we can look at in the coming period.
Yeah, so John, I'm curious, without having a dedicated data class or enum or similar, how do you manage classes that are just containers for data?
Typically, what I do would be to just use a Dart class, plain old Dart object, make all the fields final, and give it a constructor that initializes all the fields. And generally that works. And there's also some third-party solutions for immutable data types and things like that that do automatic serialization, deserialization for you if you really want something that has a lot of features. So there's plenty of solutions available, but yeah, I think this is definitely a hard, tricky design problem to figure out what's most useful and usable.
And I think that you asked something.
Go ahead.
I think you asked something else about like how can someone who's a Dataflow developer help provide us more information? Generally, we really encourage engagement in our issue trackers. If there is some request you have, please go check out the issue tracker. Please do a search first and see if someone else wrote up a ticket for it already. And if you find any such existing issues tracking things you'd like to see, we really recommend that you find like the topmost comment on GitHub and you press the thumbs up button. And from time to time, we go that as one of the signals we look at to see what to consider in a future release.
Yep, makes sense. Make heavy use of that thumbs up button when things, don't thumbs up everything maybe, but the ones you really want to see. Unless you really want to see everything, in which case, I don't know, maybe that's what we should do. So I'm gonna jump ahead in the live stream questions momentarily, because I think we answered this. So I just want to confirm, and John, you were talking about this when we were talking about multi-threading and isolates, and you were suggesting that if you're serializing, deserializing JSON, that it's nice to have it done in an isolate somewhere other than the UI thread, right?
Yeah, for large blobs, yeah.
Right. So we have a question from Dartland in the live stream who's asking, is can't count the zeros right now, but 10 or 100,000 lines of JSON, should it be, if it can be serialized on a single thread, or should it be serialized on a single thread, or do I need to make a separate isolate for a very large JSON file? Sounds like we've got the answer to that.
I think if Philip were here, he would say measure first before you optimize. So that's going to be my recommendation there. So make sure you can run a benchmark and see the problem, understand it, and see if you can improve it from there.
Yeah, I think that reminds me of our answers in the last Ask Flutter question or segment of it depends. So try it out, see what happens. It depends on your own specific JSON.
But by default, I don't use isolates for JSON because I generally don't have large JSON blobs. But
there are also a lot of the Dart APIs that are asynchronous, and generally they should not be blocking. So as long as you make sure you structure your UI so that you don't block on results from them, you should be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of blocking on results, we've got a question from Yaya, who is asking about how, so let's say I've got a function and it's relatively expensive to run, and I might need to run that multiple times, whether it's making a network call, going out to disk, making some complex calculations, whatever happens to be, it's really expensive. Is there a way to cache the result rather than having to do it again? Michael?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Or John?
Oh, John, go ahead.
Yeah, so the way I do caching is I just do it by hand. So in my Dart class, I generally just keep a private field for the most recent result that I've gotten. And if you're app is such that you can cache data in that way, then that's probably the best way to do it. If you need to persist that data, that's a separate topic. If you need to save it to disk, obviously there's more involved there. But if you can cache it in memory, that's great.
And if I just add to that, caching is tricky, right? It's not just putting it in the cache; it's also refreshing the cache, it's cleaning out the cache. It's a lot of things actually. So I would recommend, if you have a more advanced coding problem like this, sometimes go and check out the pub.dev repository and see if someone else thought of and solved this already. I know there are a bunch of packages there that handle things like caching images from the network and similar things. There's no reason to rewrite and reinvent these things. If there's a high quality solution, you can just take off the shelf.
Yeah, for example, the async package has async cache that can be used for this class of problems, which is kind of nice. So getting into maybe our fundamental, our primitive types a little bit. There's a couple of questions sort of in this vein. And sort of primitive types. So Khalid is asking, why is string capitalized when int, num, etc. are not? John?
That's a really good question. I wonder if you have an answer, John, because I remember I have asked the language team this a couple of times, but I've forgotten the answer.
Yeah, it's a mystery. No one knows.
Yeah, I have the answer for other languages, but not for Dart.
I don't actually remember. This is embarrassing.
Sounds like we'll have to follow up on that one and maybe put out a little bit of information on that one. It's a good question. But also looking at some of our other type-like things, we have Polygeek in Asheville, North Carolina, is asking if there's a way to do function comparisons. So can I say, does function 1 equal function 2? And the only documentation they found was a request made in 2011, apparently, that was rejected. So this is a question from a couple weeks ago from Ask Flutter. So Michael, function comparison.
If I can just say that first, I love the fact that we actually have issues from 2011. It just goes to show how long we've actually been working on this thing, and I think how much value we've built up over the years here. I did actually look at this not too long ago because someone asked a similar question, and I think if you find this issue, I think it's being referred to is like bug 100 and something. So it's a very, very old bug. And back then we did not support function comparisons. We do now. So you can compare top-level functions, static functions. There's a few cases around things that sort of are surrounded by states where you don't always can do comparisons because those functions are bound to their surrounding state. But in general, you can.
Excellent. So the last video we watched with Kevin and Bob was all about null safety, and so I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about null safety here as well. And so we have a question that says, I keep hearing that, and they kind of address this, but I want to dive into it. That even after null safety is adopted, so let's say I take my app and I make it null safe, but there's still a chance that there could be some runtime null exceptions. Why is that? What's going on there? John, how about you take this one?
Well, we saw a little bit of that with the late keyword when Bob and Kevin were explaining this, but there are cases where you would want that behavior. Michael, maybe you can add more.
Yeah, so I think there are two cases. There are the ones where you have an app that's entirely null safe, but we build in a couple of power features that allows you to sort of escape the system and say, I want to use that bang operator, and I want to assert that I know what the value of this is, and I know it's not null. Those are power features, and you should use them sparingly, and you should only do that in well-tested code where you know what's happening. As long as you just use the rest of the feature, you're entirely safe. Then the second category is if you have an app that has many dependencies, and let's say this is right after we launched the feature, and there's one or two of your dependencies that have not enabled null safety yet, then you end up with a combination of code that is null safe and code that isn't, which is fine. We actually build support for running that code, and in many cases it'll be fine. But sometimes when you hop over those boundaries between code that has been migrated and hasn't, some things end up being runtime checks, and you can get nulls there. So generally, we are going to recommend that everybody who owns packages, they get started migrating on those early on. And then later, when most of the packages have been migrated, we hope that app developers can come in and sort of get all their dependencies fully null safe and really stay in a sound world.
Cool. So that means I can upgrade my app and maybe hit some runtime exceptions if I haven't upgraded anything. And then once I fully upgrade, I can expect a lot fewer, maybe no runtime exceptions.
Yeah. And we're building out a lot of tooling for this. So the pub.dev side will tell you what things have migrated. When you compile your app, we'll try and give you some output so you can see whether we compile things soundly or not, and a few other things like that.
Cool. So sounds like we've got time for just a couple of questions. So trending a tiny bit into Flutterland. I know a lot of my widgets, especially stateful widgets, have a dispose method. So they have an init state and a dispose. And so along that line, like that sounds to me like constructor and destructor. And Jorge is asking, will there be a destructor in classes in the future? For example, a method that is called before we destroy an object. Will that is that in the plans? And if not, or if yes, like how does that play into Dart's current notion of object management? That last question is mine, not Jorge's, but yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah. We currently don't do it because it ends up really tying in with how the garbage collector works, right? Because if there's semantics around when you get destructed, which is when the garbage collector is about to go collect you, then that ends up with a lot of limitations on what you can do. And one of the lesser known facts about like to what big extents we go to create high performance apps is we actually customize even things like the garbage collector to work great for Flutter apps. So we basically profile Flutter apps. We know that they do a lot of object construction, so we tune that so we can do GC on those things really quickly. But that being said, I think there will be a few specialized cases where this is still a useful capacity. And very recently, for example, when we were discussing the FFI feature we talked about earlier, it turns out on that boundary between Dart code and native code, then having some notion of finalization on the native side and having that have an impact on the Dart side can actually be quite useful. So I think we might still see it in specialized cases like that. But we have no current plans to kind of do it at the general level.
That makes sense. It definitely makes sense. I am seeing in back channels that the string capitalization there's an open issue in the Dartlang repository on this topic exactly, and so if anyone watching wants to check that out, there is a discussion there. It is, as I'm looking at it, quite a long discussion actually about that topic exactly. So sounds like multiple people are confused, including our own team. So it's okay to ask that question and have that question around. Okay, so I've got one last question on the topic of Flutter, and it's kind of a yes or no question. But if Dash flutters until her flutterable wings are flutteringly fluttered, how many flutteriness widgets are left flutterless?
It's not null, I think.
Yeah, okay.
That threw a runtime exception in my brain.
All right, you got to go to null safety, John, so we can get rid of those.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have some dependencies that haven't migrated yet.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Thank you both so much for being with us. That brings us to the end of our last Ask Flutter segment of the day. Thank you, Michael and John, for coming in.
Thanks so much for all the great questions. This was joyful.
Thanks.
Yep, absolutely. That also brings us to the end of Flutter Day itself. It's been a remarkably short 24 hours, but a lot has happened. We've had over 50 countries involved, represented across almost every time zone, and over 70 meetups either already happened, in progress, or about to happen. And all of this was wrapped up under the goal of learning more about Flutter and Dart. And a lot of learning has happened indeed. I learned a lot over the last couple of sessions and all of our last Ask Flutter sessions as well. And we had a lot of code labs completed too. More than 6,000 unique people, almost 7,000 unique people visited the code labs in the last 24 hours. And nearly 1,000 people in the Flutter community Slack channels were there for the day. Along the way, we hid puzzle pieces for you to find, and only 20 minutes after our first stream, Wilson O found all of them. But learning isn't always obviously immediate. I've been really interested recently in learning more about learning. So learning science is in part the study of how people learn and the evolution, both past and future, of how to create environments for people to effectively learn. It's an evolving field itself, but there's a ton of interesting stories, studies, and research. And in reading about it, a few interesting things stood out to me. The first is struggle. If you struggled through something, does it mean that you haven't been learning? Or have you ever asked yourself how to do something, or asked a question on how to do something, gotten an answer, and only moments later completely forgotten what that answer was? Just receiving knowledge is only one part of learning. In order to solidify it, it needs to be built. Working through it and feeling like it's a struggle is okay and part of learning. The second thing I found was spacing. Long-term study turns out to be key, as learning itself is a long-term process. Are you unable to remember what the code lab you just did yesterday taught you? Studying something in a compressed amount of time, like cramming for a test or an exam, can lead to immediately good results, but not necessarily as good in the long term. But when studying is spaced out, long-term retention is much better. So go do something else for a bit and come back to it later. Giving space between it all is okay and is part of learning. The third thing was interleaving or variability. There's one study in particular where the researchers looked at different groups of piano players and asked them to practice a particular interval, so going from one key to another. And they had two groups, people who practiced the same thing again and again, exactly the same interval, and then people who practiced a variety of intervals. The varied group ended up doing a lot better on two of the researchers' key metrics. So if you're bored of trying to figure out exactly how to use the expanded widget correctly, mixing it up and working on other widgets is okay and is part of learning. Finally, what struck me was thinking through analogies. And Kepler was particularly good at this, working to find deep connections between one thing, planets, and something totally unrelated. In his case, basically anything else. These were incredibly powerful tools in helping him explain planetary motion. And so, if you see a Flutter app as a forest or a ship or a flock of dashes fluttering around, that's okay, an important part of the learning process. My own learning is a mix of all of this. I struggle, I space things out, and I come back later. I try different things, and I relentlessly try to connect it to things that are already familiar but totally unrelated. I don't know what your learning looks like, but I imagine at least some of these elements play into how your widgets are rendered. I mean, how you learn. But regardless of what the science says about learning, we all have different experiences. Our hope, at least, is that you experience Flutter Day. Your experience with Flutter Day has been one of learning, exploration, curiosity, and connection. In the meantime, thank you for being with us. Starting in less than 24 hours is Hack 20, the online international Flutter hackathon. And I'm told there are already over 140 teams registered and hundreds of people registered to those teams. And if you want to get involved yourself, head on over to flutterhackathon.com. And as always, for more about this and all of the other widgets, head on over to flutter.dev.